ค่ะสวัสดีค่ะดิฉันวันวีรากรรมการบริหารของ TMA นะคะยินดีต้อนรับทุกท่านเข้าสู่วันที่2ของออนไลน์ซีรีส์ Navigating the Future ของ TMA ในวันนี้ค่ะวันนี้ดิฉันไม่ได้มาคนเดียวนะคะมีเพื่อนมานั่งคุยด้วยอีกคนหนึ่งนะคะเนื่องจากหัวข้อที่เราจะคุยกันวันนี้เป็นเรื่องที่เกี่ยวข้องกับเรื่อง competitiveness เพราะฉะนั้นเนี่ยขออนุญาตแนะนำคุณพรกนกวิภูชนวรรณ Director ของ TMA Center for Competitiveness ค่ะคุณพรกนกเล่าให้ฟังนิดนึงค่ะวันนี้เราจะคุยกันเรื่องอะไรนะคะ
สวัสดีอีกครั้งหนึ่งนะคะค่ะสำหรับในวันนี้นะคะเราจะมารับฟังมุมมองจาก Professor Arturo Bris นะคะซึ่งเป็น Director ของ IMD for Competitiveness Center ซึ่งทาง TMA เนี่ยเราเป็นพาร์ทเนอร์กับเขาในการทำเรื่องของ Competitiveness Ranking เนี่ยมา20 กว่าปีแล้วนะคะวันนี้เนี่ยทาง Professor เนี่ยท่านก็จะมาเล่าให้เราฟังว่าเศรษฐกิจโลกภายหลังจากวิกฤตโควิดในครั้งนี้เนี่ยนะคะจะเป็นอย่างไรนะคะแล้วก็จะกระทบกับความสามารถในการแข่งขันของประเทศต่างๆอย่างไรนะคะเพราะว่าเมื่อวันอังคารที่ผ่านมาทางสถาบันเนี่ยเพิ่งประกาศผลการจัดอันดับในปีนี้ไปค่ะ
โอเคก็เนื่องจากว่าแขกของเราเป็นชาวต่างชาตินะคะดิฉันขออนุญาตเปลี่ยนเป็นภาษาอังกฤษนะคะ Good afternoon Professor Arturo Bris Good afternoon. We are now live from two locations, Lausanne, Switzerland, and TMA in Bangkok. Thank you for joining us today for a very special presentation on what's in it for business after COVID-19 and how it would affect the competitiveness of economies in the world. Professor Arturo Bris, as Kun Ponganok mentioned, is the Director of World Competitiveness Center at IMD Business School in Lausanne, Switzerland. I think it's about time. Shall we start now? Arturo, over to you, please.
Yes, of course. So, good afternoon, everybody, and hello to all my friends from TMA in Bangkok. My last weeks in confinement in Switzerland have prevented me from traveling, including one of my favorite places, as it is Bangkok and Thailand. So I'm looking forward to visiting you soon. And at least I want to be with you in the distance to present to you not only the 2020 IMD World Competitiveness Ranking, but also a good discussion about, I think, the future of the world economy in general. From where I am now in the middle of Switzerland, we're witnessing the different performance of countries regarding the pandemic and regarding specifically the recession that is going to follow the pandemic. And that's what I want to address. My key message today is going to be that more than ever, the world needs competitiveness as an objective of economic policy, because a focus on competitiveness of nations will actually preserve the prosperity of people and hence a better way out of the crisis. I'm going to start by presenting to you very briefly the results of the IMD World Competitiveness Rankings for Thailand this year. And I hope that you can see the slides that I'm going to present, in which very briefly I want to just give you some highlights about what has been happening in our ranking in 2020. Before I go into Thailand, I want to show you first the key headlines from the ranking. First of all, we see the emergence of small economies. So as you can see from the top 5, they are all smaller economies: Singapore, Denmark, Switzerland, Netherlands, and Hong Kong. The reason why we see smaller economies coming up in the rankings is that in the midst of the pandemic, it is much easier to create social consensus and also to promote and execute policies that may be hard for people. So the tough measures are much easier to implement if you are in a small country. Okay, and as you can see, the small countries are European, but also in Asia, Singapore and Hong Kong, for example. I think the second important highlight that I want to mention is that the large economies, they go down substantially, and in particular China and the United States. China is not seen in the top 20 countries here that you have, but China goes from 14 to 20 with a 6-position decline, and the US falls for the first time in its history of our rankings, of course, from the top 5 position to number 10. It was third last year. It goes down to number 10. So I think it's also noteworthy. that at the same time that the small economies re-emerge or take over the top positions, the largest economies in the world, the United States and China, have been suffering. And I think this is a combination of three factors. First of all, obviously, the effect of the pandemic have been stronger in China and the United States. Second, in the United States in particular, there's also a very severe social fragmentation that is taking a toll on the perceptions of executives, which is also reflected in the electoral process, and the fact that there is uncertainty surrounding the election. But third, finally, is that the growth rate both in China and the US have been declining, and especially in the case of China now, Chinese growth rates have been returning to normal, and we're going to see that in 2020 and certainly in 2021. So these are the big headlines from the rankings. With respect to Thailand, you can see that the performance of the country remains similar to what it used to be. I think that there is not much to add this year, other than, of course, we're in a different scenario with the pandemic, but there have been some improvements, certainly in the business efficiency and government efficiency front, but the economic performance has been also taken a toll due to the pandemic. And that's why you see here the standard, and I would say the standard, like the traditional performance of Thailand in our rankings is a strong economic performance, a reasonably good government efficiency and business efficiency that is reflected on the regulatory transformation, but also on the transformation of government practices and business practices. And finally, a less efficient or more efficient infrastructure, particularly in the sector like health and education. Whereas you can see at the very right of the graph, Thailand ranks number 55 in education out of 63 countries. So these are the must-win battles that we have been stressing for Thailand for a few years already. The need for investments in health and education that will take the company forward. But having said that, obviously, if you look at the overall ranking of Thailand, Thailand has been doing pretty solidly in the last years. Okay, when it comes to the key attractiveness indicators, I want to highlight that because when I was looking at the results for Thailand, I think that there is an amazing opportunity for the country that comes from the business-friendly environment, which is very unique, especially if you compare to European countries. So I think that we strongly believe that competitiveness is the responsibility of the government, but the responsibility of creating jobs lies within the private sector. So you cannot have a top-down approach to competitiveness. You need that the private sector takes over the responsibility of innovating, generating productivity and creating jobs. And that's why I want to emphasize that if you look at the top attractiveness indicators of Thailand, number one is the business-friendly environment. Number two is cost competitiveness. Number three is open and positive attitude. And I think this is the key opportunity for the country, because it is certainly a country where the private sector can take over the responsibility of promoting competitiveness if it has the right support from the public sector as well. I will refer back to Thailand later, and certainly I will be very much willing to take your questions during this webinar in two different ways. So if you have questions to ask and then you want to share it with us, then please use the chat that you have in your application to ask us questions. But in any case, I will try to finish in about 20-25 minutes. So 20 minutes, let's say maximum, so we can have some time for questions at the end from all of the participants in this webinar. So make sure again that you don't keep any question from you, because my objective here is to establish a dialogue and to answer questions as much as possible. Let me talk about the crisis and what is the context for the world in this current pandemic and the subsequent recession. Remember that this is not a banking crisis. This is an economic crisis in its pure sense. The transmission mechanism is not the credit channel. At the same time, it's not a surprise. That is, or at least it should not have been considered a surprise. because we expected pandemics and we knew that pandemic would happen. I think the only problem is that we were not ready to combat the pandemic. And fundamentally, and from the economic standpoint, note that the market is not pricing just the pandemic. It has been pricing the resulting recession. I think the best proof of that is that stock market in the United States, which is currently one of the markets that is suffering the most from COVID-19, that indeed rebounded. And for some companies today, the stock market price is higher than what it used to be in January. So markets are not pricing the pandemic. Markets are pricing the subsequent recession. So I want to make on that note a very important point, because to me, the outcome of countries in the coming year in particular, certainly not this year because we have not priced completely the pandemic and its effects, is that the competitiveness of countries and the competitiveness of Thailand next year is going to depend not so much on the casualties from COVID-19 and the way we deal with the medical effects or impact of the pandemic, but on how governments and how policies return the economy to a normal growth trajectory. So economic policies are going to play a very important role. Okay? In that sense, that's what I said earlier, that the recovery is going to be faster in smaller economies because social consensus and containment policies are easier to implement. That's again fundamental for us at the center. We have been claiming that the success of countries and the competitiveness of nations lies primarily on the ability to share and generate consensus with the population. And this is now a big priority when we know that government will need to take tough decisions and where people are going to lose their jobs. So the public finances, you know, here Thailand can probably show one of its strengths, are going to be also a good indicator of success. Because obviously, to the extent that you can use your balance sheet as a nation to help people, then you are going to determine which countries win and which countries fail. Take the example of Europe, in which we have countries like Switzerland, where I live, where the government has no debt to speak of. Or, for example, in countries like Saudi Arabia, where the level of debt is very low as well, compared to countries that are heavily indebted, like Spain, Italy, or the United States. So if you have the strength of the country's balance sheet, then the impact of the pandemic and therefore the competitiveness of your country is going to be much better. And now more than ever is going to be important. At the same time, you know, I heard recently in one of our webinars that we did to launch the rankings this year, how the former president of Finland, Alexander Stubb, was saying that we need more socialism now. I would put it in a different word, but my term is populism. And I think that governments today need to move towards a true populism. And what I mean by true populism is that we need the protection of the bottom of the pyramid. We need for the time being that governments care about people. This is not a financial crisis. So the damage has not been made to banks. The damage has not been made to large corporations in particular. I think the ones that have suffered the most are individuals and small and medium enterprises. And that's why for them, we need populism. We need policies that attack their problem. An additional point here. We need government expenses that do not come at the expense of people, and in particular, at the expense of investment. So we have had these discussions as well internally and externally in terms of competitiveness. Do we have more taxes or not in the current environment? And our conclusion is the following, is that the issue is not about taxes as much as about expenditures and investments. And I think countries need to preserve their investments, meaning the value creating activities like infrastructure, technology, health and education, and not spending, for example, in subsidizing the economy, which may be necessary in the short term, but doesn't generate prosperity in the long term. Okay? So government expenses cannot come at the expense of investments. Okay? And on that note, I want to also add that the relationship between the public and the private sector is going to change after 2020. So those countries that have built the bridges between the public and the private sector, and here let me say that the Thailand Management Association is a very good example that we actually use in many other countries, then unless countries have built this bridge between the public and the private sector, it's going to be very difficult that policies are implemented successfully. And this new social contract is going to be quite important because the way how we implement it is going to be key. And what I mean this contract is that we need to agree that the country will need tough measures, but governments also need to agree that those measures need to help or need to harm the weaker part of the population the least. Technology is still key, okay? And certainly we have already learned that technology plays a fundamental role in our life. Not surprisingly, I'm using a technology today to communicate with you. But technology is going to play a new and different role after the pandemic because of new ways of working, because of the necessity to transform our business into more digital businesses to avoid physical presence, and because of the new forms of mobility, for example. In that race toward recovery, sustainability is going to have a new meaning. And new meaning means that since our economies are now in pain, since we have suffered from a severe heart attack that is going to cost lives, but also is going to take a toll on the health of our countries, we need recovery. And in that recovery, sustainability has to be a differentiator, meaning that we don't promote sustainability in our economies just as a way to preserve the future. I think we're going to promote sustainability because it's going to be a way of creating value for our economies, of generating growth and prosperity and ultimately competitiveness. The sustainable development goals are more important than ever because it's the best translation that I can find of true populism from policies into people's welfare and hence competitiveness. So we need aggressive economic policies. And here I want to refer to Thailand as well because, certainly there is an agreement or a consensus that this is the case in Thailand as well. There is no room for monetary policy in the traditional sense. We should expect a recession that is in double digits for most of the countries. And my rule of thumb is that if there is a recession of 10% of GDP, we must contain that with a public expenditure of 10% of GDP. Okay, where the objectives of those interventions and this support by the state has to be preservation of long-term employment, preventing business closures, and then allow for a recovery of consumption after lockdown, and in particular in countries that have suffered a severe lockdown. Okay. Job losses are going to be the big problem. And obviously, the challenge that Thailand is going to be confronted with is that one of its sectors that employ most people is the tourism. And tourism depends to a great extent on foreign forces, not on domestic forces. And in that struggle, the economy of Thailand is going to suffer a lot. So as I was saying earlier, a recession is going to be extremely costly. But we need to make sure that we adapt our businesses to the fact that the international sources of value are going to be much lower. And I know and I'm aware that Thailand is making a very strong effort to preserve and restore the touristic sector, tourism, but that's going to be extremely difficult. And in the short term, I think we need to attack the damage of the pandemic on the population and in its economic form in a very, very aggressive way. Okay. The lion's share of the damage is going to be small and medium enterprises. So that's something that makes this crisis unique as well, because in the 2008 crisis, the companies that suffered the most were the large organizations, large banks and large companies. Now it's going to be the reverse. Because of the disrupted global supply chain and the lack of access to financing and the low cash holdings of small and medium enterprises, they need particular support. And they are going to suffer a lot. So that's why I think our policies need to provide a stronger support to this type of companies. And this support has to preserve two key objectives. One is to preserve employment and prosperity. And the second one is to preserve the financial sustainability of the firms. That is, if you think of some of the things that we're doing in Europe in terms of economic policy, sometimes I find quite very confusing, because what our small and medium enterprises need is direct support. They don't need, for example, loan guarantees by which they can borrow more and then they can continue operating. More borrowing means that you just defer your problems from the present to the future. What companies need is direct support. That's why I talk about the financial sustainability of firms. The first point is much clearer. I think the policies that try to restore the economy, they should preserve employment and prosperity. Okay, and that's why I put in a question mark there whether it is not the time now of implementing minimum income or universal basic income scheme, especially in economies like Thailand, in which there is economic inequality and income inequality, but the strength of the economy is such that this would be possible, especially with respect to other countries, other neighboring countries. Okay. Let me wrap up, okay, and give you the last idea that I want to share with you. We started 2020 with already a trend towards deglobalization, in which national policies and domestic forces were becoming more important at the expense of the global economy. And the reason for that was that China and the US entered into a trading war that was harmful for other countries, in particular countries like India or Brazil or Thailand or Kazakhstan or Italy, because they are mid-sized countries that rely a lot on foreign trade. So this led to a process of deglobalization, in which countries started to look inwards. Country factors then become more important than global factors. But the pandemic has exacerbated this phenomenon. Okay? And now we have more walls rather than less. And now, because we know that the pandemic extends geographically, then we shut down our borders and we build more walls. And these walls are both mental and economic. So that is going to continue for some time, maybe months, maybe years. And this trend to this towards deglobalization, means that governments are going to be now more important than ever. So countries with good policies and with healthy finances and with more local supply chains are going to benefit. Those countries that promote internal markets are going to do better. Competitiveness then becomes now more important than ever, because the role of domestic forces, and particularly the role of governments, gets exacerbated when you don't depend so much on the foreign sector. So this is going to be quite important to take into account. Competitiveness then become an important factor and consideration, because what we have been saying in our centers for decades already is that for countries to succeed, they need to provide prosperity, quality of life, jobs, salaries to people. And this is done by designing industrial policies that generate productive jobs. This is done by designing also institutions at the government level that make sure that the public sector is there to help, not to hinder activities. And finally, this prosperity, this quality of life, this competitiveness is also achieved through sustainability, through talent, and through technology. And that's why the role of technology is going to be extremely important in the pandemic. And it has to be one important ingredient of the competitiveness of Thailand. As remote work becomes the norm, again, technology will be critical. We have realized that automation actually is not a threat to productivity, actually can help towards productivity. So we will need to rely much more on local innovations. And because of the aspect of talent that I mentioned, that talent is going to be one of the key factors in competitiveness, digital talent is also going to be a key differentiator that needs to be promoted domestically, because we're going to be building more walls. Okay, so all in all, I think that to me, in the current environment, preserving employment and prosperity is key for future competitiveness. And this is even a tautology, because preserving employment and prosperity is nothing different from preserving competitiveness. Thailand is doing the right thing. When I look at the measures that you are doing, for example, a promotion of foreign investment to attract more capital, making sure that the touristic sector is reenacted and restarted, making sure that people are helped, especially those who suffer. I think this is the right thing to do. I also think that the country is well positioned to navigate the crisis because of your economic strength. There are some, of course, clouds in the horizon, and particularly the weakness of the touristic sector, and to what extent people are going to go back to Thailand. But I think the optimal policies to come out of the crisis have to guarantee employment and consumption beyond 2020. Okay, so I hope this triggers a certain discussion, or at least a certain thought and reflection on your part, and I would be very much willing to take any questions. Remember that I will also be willing to share this presentation with you, and I will share it with you through my TMA friends. And I'm looking forward to getting your comments and questions. Again, if you want to use the chat or if you want to ask directly, please let me know. Here I am for you. So it's time for questions now.
The question. The question is, what should SME do to survive this crisis?
Well, so obviously that's a good question, because what I have mentioned is how can government support SMEs, but I haven't said what SMEs should do. So what is fundamental here is to innovate in our business model, so we substitute global supply chains with local supply chains. So in a world in which there are going to be much more barriers to trade, and under the realization that we have relied too much on other markets, particularly China, I think that we SMEs should substitute their supply chains with more local supply chains. Very often, this will require that they transform their business model, because obviously local supply chain can be more important, more expensive than international supply chains.
Yes. Another question is that, Thailand relies so much on travel and tourism business. What would be your suggestion to, Thailand or any other country with this, same problem?
Yes. So remember that for those of you that do not know me, I'm Spanish, and Spain faces the same problem like Thailand, because 12% of our GDP actually come from tourism, and we're suffering a lot because tourists are not coming. I think that we need to realize that for tourists to come to our country, I think we need to work on two directions. One direction is certainly work with those who can bring the tourists to us, and this is particularly airlines or travel agents. And I think we need to provide with support, subsidies, or incentives for airlines to come to Thailand. That's number one. But number two, I think that this will happen only if domestically we truly transform ourselves so we come across as a safe country. And at the end of the day, there is not much that I can do if I'm a company in the sector. But what the country can do as a whole is to just fight the pandemic in the most possible efficient way, and to show to the rest of the world that we're taking measures to prevent any contagion, and that we're keeping safety in our country so tourists can come. Okay? This is not just about image. So I am very much reluctant to image campaigns, because most countries are doing that. I think we need to show the reality of the country by making sure that people are safe when they come.
Yes, seems to be a common problem for many countries in the world on this issue agenda. Yeah. it's tough time. We have to try very hard to survive anyway.
And there's not, very often there is not much that you can do, because if airlines are shut down and they're not traveling, it doesn't matter how well you do domestically, they are not coming anyway. So I think we need to work on these two fronts. We need to make sure that we enter into agreement with airlines and with their countries so they fly. Okay? And this depends on our safety, but it depends also on our ability to entice them through incentives. Okay?
Yes, exactly. Any other question from Kun Kanok?
I think right now so many people saying about that this COVID crisis has shown that Thailand is very strong in healthcare sector. So, do you think this could be one of the opportunity for Thailand?
Yes. So that's why I say in my conclusions that Thailand is very well positioned to navigate the crisis, because especially compared to the other countries in the region, it is doing much better. Okay, that relatively speaking, and the health infrastructure is, for example, much better than the others. Let me give you one indicator. You know, the health infrastructure of Thailand is one of the biggest increases that you enjoy this year in our rankings, not only compared to other countries in the neighborhood, but other countries in the world. So there has been a lot of improvement done, and the perception about the quality of the health system has also improved a lot. Okay? And I think that has to be an asset for the recovery. And I must tell you as well that there is awareness from our side, from where I am now, that in fact Thailand has done much better in that front than other countries. Okay.
There is another question on the screen regarding to supply chain. What is the most important part for future
Supply chain.
For future supply chain? What is your suggestion to Thailand?
I think that I'm not a supply chain expert, but I can tell you my perception. My perception is that I think we have substituted supply chain just because of cost. And for example, we are relying on China for many of our production needs, just because it is much cheaper. And I think that now we have realized that the cost that we are paying at the end, once you have these barriers due to a pandemic, make these cost savings that were initially high not such. So I think to me that the future of supply chains goes by the realization that what you want to have is risk-free supply chains, even if they become more costly. And that's why I talked earlier about local supply chains and this substitution. If I can get my suppliers domestically, even if it costs me more, in the long term, this will guarantee that I create more value. Because when you have disruptions to the supply chain, local suppliers will not be affected. So that will be, to me, the key ingredient.
I think, yeah, there's no other question. And I think that's about a wrap for the presentation today from Professor Arturo Bris from IMD Business School in Lausanne, Switzerland. I thank you very much, Arturo, for being with us this evening. And we are looking forward to seeing you again in September for our Thailand Competitiveness Conference.